Well, GM's future in the spotlight at the White House tonight. CEO Mary Barra is quoted as saying a private meeting with the president was productive and valuable. It comes as GM takes the lead in union talks and heat for plant closing.
For decades, the phrase "Made in America" wasn't just a slogan. It was a promise of jobs, stability, and national pride. General Motors, once the largest automaker on Earth and a symbol of American might, embodied that promise. In the 1950s and 1960s, it employed more than 600,000 US workers. Entire cities across Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania grew around its factories. GM wasn't just building cars, it was building the American middle class. But in 2025, that promise is gone. Quietly, methodically, and with the precision of a corporate chess master, GM has reshaped itself into something beyond American borders. Today, 1 out of every 3 GM vehicles sold in the United States comes from Mexico. Executive functions are shifting to Europe and Asia. Critical supply chains for lithium and cobalt are anchored in Africa and Southeast Asia. The badge on the hood may still say Chevrolet or Cadillac, but the reality is stark. General Motors is no longer an American company in the traditional sense. What happened? The unraveling didn't come from a single decision. It wasn't just tariffs or labor costs or Wall Street greed. It was a decade-long transformation, a deliberate evolution from national champion to borderless entity. And while Washington tried to impose rules and workers fought to hold on to jobs, GM quietly outgrew them all. This is the story of how tariffs backfired, how Wall Street rewarded betrayal, how entire regions collapsed, and how one corporation turned Made in America into a relic of the past. Real quick, if you're into videos that cut through the noise and break things down clearly, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find this, and if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. We've got more deep dives coming your way. Also, drop a comment and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your take. Now onto the video. For more than a century, America's corporate giants have played by a predictable set of rules. Companies lobbied quietly, presidents flexed their authority publicly, and whenever conflicts arose, they were managed behind closed doors. But in 2024, General Motors broke that tradition in spectacular fashion. It started with a press conference that few expected to change the trajectory of the American auto industry. Mary Barra, CEO of General Motors, stepped up to the podium and, without hesitation, challenged the very government that once bailed out her company. Her words carried the calm precision of a prepared strike. GM had contingency plans to absorb as much as 50% of the new tariffs without raising prices, without cutting production, and without begging for relief. This was not corporate diplomacy, it was corporate defiance. Barra's message was clear: we are not your pawn. The reaction was immediate. Within hours, financial news outlets dissected her statement, while political commentators scrambled to interpret its meaning. Investors were split. Some feared retaliation from Washington would crush GM's share price. Others saw something different: confidence, foresight, and leverage. To understand why this moment was seismic, one has to compare GM's approach to that of its biggest rival, Ford. Jim Farley, Ford's CEO, issued a statement calling the tariffs chaotic and destabilizing. His tone was cautious, almost pleading. He criticized the policy but stopped short of challenging presidential authority. GM, on the other hand, didn't just criticize, it drew a line in the sand. Behind the scenes, GM's leadership was already executing a sophisticated response plan. Task forces were activated, supply lines were mapped and recalibrated, contracts were reviewed to identify weak points and leverage opportunities. CFO Paul Jacobson even issued a parallel statement outlining how GM could reroute production, renegotiate material costs, and essentially outmaneuver Washington's economic squeeze. Washington did not take this lightly. Allies of the president blasted GM as unpatriotic. Conservative media framed the company as betraying American workers in favor of global profits. Hashtags like #BoycottGM trended on social platforms. Some lawmakers even floated the idea of targeting GM with punitive measures beyond tariffs. But GM didn't budge. Barra refused to soften her language. The company doubled down, signaling to Wall Street, to competitors, and to the American public that it was prepared to fight, not comply. This was a turning point for corporate America. The old unspoken pact that presidents set the rules and corporations followed them was broken. GM had demonstrated something profound. When a corporation controls supply chains across continents and capital across markets, the power balance shifts. Washington could impose tariffs, but GM could maneuver around them. In the months that followed, the business world would look back on this moment as the opening salvo of a larger war. It wasn't just about cars or tariffs, it was about sovereignty. Who really controlled the future of American industry? The government or the corporations themselves? Barra's declaration was more than a press conference. It was a warning shot, and it made clear that the battleground ahead would be unlike anything the auto industry had faced before. The White House's response to GM's defiance was swift and severe. In mid-2024, the administration rolled out a new round of tariffs, not on finished vehicles this time, but on the raw materials that form the backbone of manufacturing. Steel imports would now carry a 25% duty. Aluminum, the lightweight metal essential for modern vehicles, would face a 10% tax. These numbers might sound technical, but their impact was immediate and devastating. Steel beams, engine blocks, battery casings, and aluminum body panels suddenly became significantly more expensive to import. For automakers, this was like raising the cost of oxygen in an already suffocating room. Margins evaporated. Vehicles that once turned a modest 3 to 5% profit were now barely breaking even, or worse, losing money. Electric vehicles, which rely heavily on aluminum to reduce weight and extend range, became especially vulnerable. For some models, the cost increase pushed them into the red before they even rolled off the assembly line. Smaller suppliers, those Tier 2 and Tier 3 companies that rarely make headlines but form the hidden scaffolding of the auto industry, were the first to collapse. These firms provided everything from stamped parts to specialised wiring. Dependent on affordable steel and aluminum, many could not survive the sudden spike in costs. Within weeks, regional economies across Michigan, Ohio and Wisconsin began to crack under the strain. Dealerships felt the shockwaves too. Price quotes jumped overnight. Consumers who had been considering a new car suddenly froze, unwilling to shoulder the extra costs. Lenders recalculated residual values, which meant leasing became more expensive. Dealership lots, already strained by chip shortages and supply chain delays in prior years, now looked more like graveyards. Cars sat unsold as buyers hesitated. The political fallout was intense. Supporters of the tariffs framed them as a necessary sacrifice to protect American jobs. Critics warned that the policy was backfiring, accelerating the decline of US manufacturing instead of reviving it. Economists debated on television, but for automakers, the debate wasn't theoretical, it was existential. Ford scrambled to renegotiate supplier contracts. Stellantis cut back on production schedules. Honda and Toyota raised sticker prices. Panic spread across boardrooms as executives tried to calculate how much longer they could absorb the hit. But GM was different. It didn't panic. Instead, it executed. While competitors played defense, GM shifted to offense. The company had locked in fixed price agreements for steel and aluminum years earlier, insulating itself from the immediate price shock. While those contracts weren't permanent, they bought GM precious time to recalibrate its strategy. And that strategy was more sophisticated than anyone realized. Behind the headlines, GM had already constructed a corporate firewall, a decade-long plan that allowed it to reroute supply chains, shift production, and minimize dependence on US resources. The tariffs, which were supposed to bring automakers to heel, instead highlighted how thoroughly GM had outgrown national boundaries. To Washington, this was economic warfare. To GM, it was just another variable in a global equation. The earthquake had shaken the auto industry to its core, but for GM, it was only the beginning of a story that had been set in motion years earlier. To understand GM's uncanny ability to shrug off tariffs, you have to rewind nearly a decade. The seeds of its strategy were planted long before anyone in Washington uttered the word trade war. In the mid-2010s, GM executives were already worried. Labour costs in the US were climbing. Political cycles were growing more unpredictable, swinging from pro-business deregulation to populist protectionism every few years. Environmental regulations were tightening. Global competitors from Japan, South Korea, and eventually China were ramping up efficiency with lower costs. GM's conclusion was blunt. Relying too heavily on US infrastructure was a long-term liability. So the company moved. Quietly, methodically, and without fanfare, it began to spread its manufacturing footprint across the globe. Plants opened in Mexico, in China, and across Southeast Asia. This wasn't the shallow outsourcing of past decades, where low-end assembly was shifted overseas while core operations stayed home. GM went deeper. It diversified not just where cars were assembled, but where parts were sourced, batteries were built, and logistics routes were anchored. By the early 2020s, Mexico had become central to GM's operations. 4 massive facilities in places like Ramos Arizpe and Silao were producing hundreds of thousands of vehicles each year. These weren't budget models or low-margin experiments. They were flagship vehicles: the Chevrolet Equinox, Silverado, Blazer, and the GMC Sierra, sold directly into the US market. At the same time, GM was expanding its EV supply chain abroad. Battery modules were manufactured in Asia. Powertrains were shipped from overseas facilities. Contracts with foreign suppliers were structured to minimize exposure to sudden political shifts. By 2024, the results were staggering. Nearly 1 in 3 GM vehicles sold in the United States was built outside its borders. This wasn't a reaction to tariffs, it was preparation for them. When Washington raised barriers, GM simply rerouted production. When costs spiked domestically, GM leaned on foreign contracts negotiated years earlier. The brilliance of this plan was in its invisibility. To the average consumer walking into a dealership, nothing seemed different. The cars still wore Chevrolet, GMC, and Cadillac badges. The marketing still wrapped itself in American flags and heartland imagery. Politicians could still stage campaign stops in Detroit. But behind the scenes, GM had already become something new, a post-national corporation, immune to the pressures of any single government. What looked like resilience in 2024 was actually foresight. G didn't prepare for a trade war in 6 months. It had spent a decade constructing a firewall. And that firewall would soon enable its boldest maneuver yet, a $60 billion promise that would fool almost everyone. After weeks of political pressure, investor unease, and public outrage, GM unveiled what appeared to be a patriotic masterstroke, a promise of $60 billion in new US investment. The announcement was choreographed perfectly. Executives delivered speeches flanked by American flags. News anchors praised it as proof that tariffs were working. Lawmakers rushed to claim credit for bringing jobs back. President Trump himself declared it a victory, saying the announcement validated his protectionist policies. The headlines wrote themselves: GM reinvests in America. Jobs returning to the heartland. Detroit revival underway. But buried in the fine print was a very different reality. The majority of that $60 billion wasn't earmarked for breaking ground on new factories or hiring thousands of line workers. Instead, it was directed toward modernization, automation, and capacity upgrades. In other words, machines, not people. At a Midwestern plant, touted as one of the big winners of this reinvestment, internal projections showed a 20% decline in actual headcount once new machinery was installed. Another facility informed union leaders that the upgrades would enhance efficiency and optimize workflows, euphemisms for replacing human workers with robotics and AI-driven production systems. The cruel irony was that communities desperate for revival clung to hope. In Lordstown, Ohio, which had seen factories shutter in earlier decades, local leaders revived infrastructure plans. Schools began to reintroduce vocational training programs. Real estate speculation ticked upward as families bought homes in anticipation of a new economic boom. But the boom never came. The $60 billion wasn't about reopening towns. It was about consolidating GM's global strategy, using technology to ensure that when production happened in the US, it required fewer people than ever before. Union leaders sounded alarms. Investment should mean jobs, one representative argued on national television. But what we're seeing is a bait and switch. They announce billions, collect tax incentives, and then automate the workforce. GM executives countered with smooth press releases full of buzzwords: mobility, opportunity, transformation. Not once did they specify a headcount. The truth was simple. This wasn't a homecoming. It was a performance. A mirage staged to calm Wall Street, placate Washington, and keep consumers loyal. And for a time, it worked. Stocks stabilized. Politicians took victory laps. The media moved on. But behind the illusion, the groundwork was being laid for something even more audacious. GM wasn't just retooling factories, it was expanding power abroad. While America debated whether $60 billion meant salvation, GM was doubling down on its international strategy. Mexico was at the center of it, and Tesla was about to become the perfect foil. If tariffs were designed to bully automakers into reshoring production, GM showed how easily they could be sidestepped. But another automaker, the poster child of American innovation, found itself trapped. In early 2024, Elon Musk announced with his trademark bravado a multi-billion-dollar gigafactory in Mexico. It was pitched as Tesla's next-generation hub, promising to revolutionize efficiency, scale production globally, and serve as proof that Tesla could dominate the EV market far beyond American borders. At first, the plan drew applause. Investors hailed it as visionary. Mexican officials touted the thousands of jobs it would bring. Musk, never shy about showmanship, described it as a cornerstone for Tesla's global ambitions. But when Trump escalated tariffs, 25% on vehicles, new duties on steel and aluminum, the project unraveled. Overnight, the economics collapsed. Every Tesla exported from Mexico to the US would face crippling costs. Suddenly, the futuristic gigafactory was no longer a beacon of efficiency, but a financial liability. Within months, Tesla shelved the plan, citing market volatility. Behind closed doors, the real reason was obvious: political risk. Unlike GM, Tesla had not spent a decade insulating itself with contracts, diversified logistics, and parallel production lines. Its strategy was vulnerable, dependent on favourable political winds. And when those winds shifted, Tesla had no defence. GM, meanwhile, was thriving. Its Mexican facilities weren't pipe dreams, they were already humming. In 2024 alone, more than 700,000 vehicles rolled off Mexican assembly lines, including flagship models like the Chevrolet Equinox, Silverado, and GMC Sierra. Nearly 1 out of every 3 GM vehicles sold in the United States came from across the southern border. The contrast was stark. Tesla, despite its futuristic branding, was forced into retreat. GM, often derided as an aging dinosaur of the industry, surged ahead. Where Tesla saw risk, GM saw opportunity. Where Tesla pulled back, GM doubled down. This dynamic revealed a deeper truth. Tariffs didn't bring production back home. They accelerated globalization for companies prepared to exploit it. GM had not only prepared, it had mastered the game. But Mexico was only part of the puzzle. While Tesla and others stumbled over geopolitics, GM had already shifted its focus to a different battleground, one that would determine the future of the entire auto industry: control over the minerals that power the electric revolution. In the 20th century, oil powered the automotive industry. In the 21st century, it is lithium, cobalt, and nickel. Without them, no electric vehicle rolls off the line. Without them, batteries fail, range disappears, and innovation halts. Whoever controls these minerals controls the future of mobility. GM understood this earlier than most. While rivals focused on reshoring assembly lines or marketing patriotic slogans, GM went straight to the mines. Beginning in the late 2010s and accelerating through the 2020s, GM executives quietly secured long-term contracts across the globe. In Argentina, GM locked in lithium supplies from the resource-rich salt flats of the Lithium Triangle. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, it gained access to cobalt mines, often at controversial human and environmental costs. In Indonesia, it tapped into nickel refining capacity, forging partnerships that reshaped local economies. And in China, GM partnered with tech and battery firms to secure both materials and refining technology, raising eyebrows in Washington but delivering unmatched stability abroad. The results were staggering. By 2024, GM's global battery capacity exceeded internal forecasts by 30%. Its production lines didn't just run, they ran on predictable, pre-negotiated pricing insulated from the spot market chaos that plagued competitors. While Ford and others scrambled to pay inflated rates for lithium, GM's contracts locked in costs years in advance. This wasn't outsourcing, it was empire building. GM wasn't just making cars anymore, it was constructing a vertically integrated supply chain, from raw minerals to finished batteries, beyond the reach of any single government's control. The geopolitical implications were profound. Countries desperate for foreign investment bent over backward to accommodate GM. Tax breaks, infrastructure access, and land rights were offered in exchange for partnerships. In some regions, GM's mineral contracts were so valuable that they shaped national economic strategies. For investors, this was a goldmine, literally. Wall Street saw GM not as a struggling automaker, but as a global commodities empire disguised as a car company. But for workers in America's industrial heartland, this strategy was a bitter pill. While GM secured lithium in South America and cobalt in Africa, towns in Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin were collapsing. For them, GM's global empire building wasn't a triumph, it was abandonment. Still, from GM's perspective, the logic was undeniable. Tariffs, political cycles, and domestic unrest could disrupt assembly plants. But minerals were universal. Control the inputs, and you control the future. And by 2024, GM controlled enough of the inputs to insulate itself from almost any political storm. That insulation came at a cost, rage at home that was about to boil over. While GM celebrated its victories abroad and Wall Street rewarded its resilience, the story was very different on the ground in America's industrial heartland. Cities that had once lived and breathed General Motors, places like Flint, Detroit, Dayton, and Lordstown, were left simmering in frustration and despair. For decades, these communities had survived on the promise that even if times were tough, even if recessions hit, GM would always come back. Workers carried union cards with pride, families bought the vehicles they helped build, and entire local economies thrived around factory shifts and assembly lines. But by 2025, that promise was broken. As the company quietly redirected production to Mexico and leaned on its decade-long global playbook, US plants were shuttered or downsized. Job postings dwindled. Reinvestment projects turned out to be automation initiatives that eliminated more positions than they created. Communities that had once been defined by the hum of assembly lines now heard silence. The anger boiled over. Workers began chaining themselves to factory gates, holding hand-painted signs that read, "You promised us a future." Union leaders took to national television, denouncing GM's leadership as traitors to the American worker. Local mayors scrambled to provide answers, but there were few to give. The emotional toll was just as severe as the financial one. In places like Janesville, Wisconsin, where residents had been told jobs were coming back, families made decisions based on hope. Some bought homes, others enrolled in retraining programs expecting a resurgence of manufacturing jobs. Instead, they found empty lots and cancelled projects. The sense of betrayal ran deep. Populist voices seized the moment. Radio hosts fanned outrage, framing GM's actions as not just economic abandonment, but outright treason. In some towns, the protests grew heated. Old union halls once used for bargaining became meeting grounds for rallies. Across the Midwest, the phrase "GM sold us out" became more than a complaint. It became a rallying cry. The company, of course, didn't remain silent. It ran glossy ad campaigns showcasing electric vehicles being assembled in modern factories. Commercials featured diverse workers, waving flags, smiling as they welded and assembled under patriotic slogans. But workers on the ground weren't fooled. They saw the contrast between the polished commercials and the empty parking lots at their local plants. For the Rust Belt, the shift was more than economic. It was cultural. GM had once been a source of pride, a symbol of American craftsmanship. Now it was viewed as a faceless corporation with no allegiance. The protests didn't go unnoticed. Politicians began to take note as headlines filled with images of angry workers, shuttered plants, and economic despair. Washington, once eager to celebrate GM's resilience, began to sense a growing backlash. The stage was set for the next battle, a political reversal in the nation's capital. At first, Washington had cheered GM's defiance. Lawmakers praised its resilience, citing its EV expansion and $60 billion reinvestment as proof that American industry could adapt. But politics is a game of optics, and when the optics shifted, when protests spread across the Rust Belt and workers took to national television, the mood in Washington changed. Congressional leaders began demanding hearings. Committees launched investigations into GM's contracts, particularly its deals with foreign mineral suppliers in China, Indonesia, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Senators questioned whether GM was leveraging American tax incentives while funneling resources abroad. The political rhetoric shifted fast. Lawmakers who once posed for photo ops at GM plants now spoke of betrayal and deception. Electric vehicle subsidies, once bipartisan, suddenly became contentious. Republican populists framed them as giveaways to corporations that had abandoned US workers. Progressive Democrats criticized GM's reliance on questionable foreign supply chains with poor human rights records. Hearings were called. Union leaders testified about automation replacing jobs. Workers described towns hollowed out by false promises. Economists laid out charts showing how tariffs had backfired, accelerating offshoring rather than reversing it. Bills were introduced to revoke tax breaks for automakers that sourced more than 30% of parts outside North America. Others proposed stricter transparency rules on foreign mineral contracts. Some lawmakers even floated punitive measures for corporations deemed to have misled the public about job creation. But for GM, it was all noise. The company had already evolved beyond Washington's reach. Subsidies were helpful, but not essential. Regulations could be absorbed or routed around. The truth was simple. GM no longer needed American policymakers to thrive. Its empire was global, diversified, and agile. That didn't stop the political theatre. In one dramatic exchange during a televised hearing, a senator held up a photo of a shuttered GM plant and asked, "Can you explain to these workers why you're building jobs in Mexico while telling us you're reinvesting here?" A GM executive responded with vague references to mobility ecosystems and future-ready transitions, sidestepping the question entirely. The hearings generated headlines, but little else. GM's stock remained steady. Investors weren't worried. The company had already priced political risk into its strategy. By the time Washington realised how little leverage it had, the damage was done. GM had built an identity beyond borders, immune to the threats of lawmakers. The government could shout, but GM was already moving on. And while Washington struggled, another group was celebrating. Wall Street was cashing in on GM's global transformation and making it clear which side of the battle it had chosen. If the Rust Belt felt abandoned and Washington felt powerless, Wall Street felt something entirely different: euphoria. When GM confirmed that domestic sourcing was no longer a top priority, investors didn't recoil. They pounced. Private equity firms, hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds, and institutional investors like BlackRock and Vanguard all increased their positions in GM stock. What workers saw as betrayal, investors saw as bold strategy. Shares that had dipped during the tariff panic rebounded sharply. In fact, the moment GM openly announced its shift to flexible global logistics, its stock jumped 6 points in after-hours trading. Wall Street wasn't concerned about jobs in Michigan. It cared about margins, growth, and resilience, and GM's global pivot delivered all three. Tech investors were particularly enthusiastic. To them, GM was no longer just a car maker. It was a logistics and data platform, a borderless company that could generate revenue across continents. They weren't buying trucks and SUVs. They were buying what GM itself described in investor calls as post-geographic revenue streams. Sovereign wealth funds from Asia and the Middle East poured in money too. These state-backed investors weren't motivated by nationalism or sentiment. They were motivated by structural leverage. GM's contracts for lithium in Argentina, cobalt in Africa, and refining in Southeast Asia provided exactly that: access to critical resources and industries that would define the 21st century. But not everyone shared in the gains. Small investors, American pension funds, union retirement accounts, and mum-and-pop shareholders who had held GM stock out of loyalty were left behind. Their influence diminished as large institutional investors took control of voting power. The symbolism was brutal. The workers who had built GM no longer owned it. Wall Street and foreign investors did. For financial markets, this wasn't just about GM. It was a signal about the future of capitalism itself. Nationalism might play well in political speeches, but it was irrelevant in boardrooms. Profit came first, and profit was global. This divergence, workers left behind, investors celebrating, set the stage for one final clash. Because if Wall Street was cheering, one man was raging: the president who had built his entire political identity on reviving American manufacturing. By late 2025, Donald Trump was fighting his last battle with the American auto industry. For nearly a decade, he had promised to bring jobs back, to punish companies that outsourced, and to force corporate America to play by American rules. GM's borderless pivot represented not just an economic challenge, but a personal humiliation. Trump launched a series of fiery speeches across Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. He accused GM leadership of betraying American workers, calling them traitors to the flag. He proposed legislation to strip federal contracts from companies that offshored jobs. At one rally, he even floated the idea of criminal penalties for corporate leaders who moved operations overseas. But none of it stuck. Congress didn't act. Investors ignored him. The media, once captivated by his trade wars, had shifted attention to other crises. Trump's threats sounded more like echoes of a past era than commands shaping the present. GM, meanwhile, pressed forward with its final transformation. In late 2025, it announced the relocation of key executive functions, including financial planning, innovation labs, and platform strategy divisions, to Singapore and Berlin. Detroit, once the beating heart of GM, was reduced to a heritage hub. The company unveiled its new identity, not as a car maker, but as a global mobility solutions platform. Cars were only one piece of a larger portfolio that included battery software, ride-sharing networks, renewable logistics, and cross-border data infrastructure. The symbolism was unmistakable. GM no longer saw itself as an American company. It saw itself as a borderless entity, a platform untethered from geography, loyalty, or politics. For workers in the Midwest, this was the end of an era. For Wall Street, it was the dawn of a new business model. For Washington, it was a defeat. The old balance of power, where governments dictated terms and corporations complied, was gone. Trump's tariff war had not brought jobs back. It had accelerated the globalization of America's largest automaker. His final stand ended not with a factory reopening, but with GM relocating its brainpower abroad. When historians look back at the early 21st century, they may see this as a turning point, the moment when the promise of Made in America collapsed, replaced by an era of post-national corporations and borderless capital. The question for America is simple. Was GM saving itself or selling the nation out? General Motors once stood as the backbone of American industry. It employed hundreds of thousands, fueled communities, and symbolized the strength of the US middle class. But by 2025, GM had transformed into something else entirely, a borderless empire that owed allegiance to no nation. Tariffs meant to force factories home only accelerated the trend. Politicians lost leverage, workers lost jobs, Wall Street gained profits, and in the end, the phrase "Made in America" became less a promise and more an illusion. GM's pivot raises questions far bigger than cars. If corporations no longer belong to countries, what happens to the people and places they leave behind? What happens to national identity when capital flows freely across borders, but workers cannot? The collapse of Made in America is not just GM's story. It is a story about the future of global capitalism. Whether it will be remembered as progress or betrayal depends on who tells it. Once again, thanks for watching this video. If you got something out of this, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And hey, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Agree, disagree, or something in between? I'd love to hear it.